The land was dying, and everyone in Bethlehem knew it. The fields that had once swayed with heavy golden barley under the warm Judean sun now lay cracked and pale, like the skin of something long forgotten. In the ancient Hebrew tongue, the name Bethlehem meant house of bread, but in those bitter days, there was no bread, no rain, and no relief anywhere in sight. Elimelech was a man who belonged to this town, a man of the tribe of Judah, one of God's own covenant people. That word, covenant, carried the weight of the entire universe for people like him. It meant a sacred, unbreakable promise between the living God and the nation of Israel, a promise that said, "I will be your God, and you will be my people." It was not a contract between equals. It was a vow made by the Creator himself, sealed not with ink, but with blood and fire and the memory of miracles. Elimelech had grown up knowing that promise in his bones. He had a wife named Naomi, whose name in Hebrew meant pleasant, and she was exactly that. She was warm and strong and deeply faithful, the kind of woman who held a household together not by force, but by the quiet gravity of her love. Their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, were still young, still full of the restless energy of boys who had not yet learned what the world could take from them. When the famine grew worse and the silence of empty fields became unbearable, Elimelech made a decision. He would take his family east, across the deep Rift Valley and beyond the shimmering waters of the Salt Sea, into the foreign highlands of Moab. It was not a decision made lightly. Every Israelite knew that Moab was not their land and not their people. The Moabites were distant relatives in the oldest sense, descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. But they were outsiders to the covenant, strangers to the promises of God. Still, a man with a hungry family does not always have the luxury of waiting for better options. The road from Bethlehem to Moab was long and hard, winding down through rocky ravines and then climbing back up into the plateau country on the eastern side of the valley. The boys would have walked close to their mother. Elimelech would have walked ahead, saying little, carrying more than his share of the weight in every sense. They arrived in Moab as foreigners, as sojourners, people with no land, no rights, and no guarantee of welcome. But they stayed, and for a time, life continued. Then Elimelech died. The Bible does not tell us how. It does not give us a long passage of mourning or a careful explanation of his illness. It simply says he died. And just like that, Naomi was alone in a foreign country with two sons and the kind of grief that sits in your chest like a stone that never fully dissolves. She had followed her husband into exile, a word that for an Israelite meant not just distance from home, but distance from everything familiar, everything sacred, everything that gave life its meaning. And now the man she had followed was gone. But life, as it always does, pressed forward. Mahlon and Chilion grew into young men in Moab, and in time they married Moabite women. Mahlon married a woman named Ruth. Chilion married a woman named Orpah. These were not Israelite women. They had not grown up hearing the stories of Abraham and Moses and the God who parted the sea. They were daughters of Moab, raised under a different sky, with different gods and different customs. And yet here they were, woven into this small, displaced Israelite family by the invisible threads of love and ordinary life. For about 10 years, the four of them lived together in Moab. 10 years of shared meals and shared seasons, of watching the same harvests come and go, of building the quiet, unspoken language that only people who truly live together ever develop. And then, in what must have felt like a cruelty almost too heavy to bear, both Mahlon and Chilion died as well. 3 women, 3 widows, no men, no protection, no inheritance, no future that anyone looking from the outside could see clearly. In the ancient world, a widow without sons or a father or a brother to speak for her was among the most vulnerable people imaginable. The law of Israel had special provisions for widows and orphans, precisely because everyone understood how easily they could be overlooked, forgotten, or taken advantage of. Naomi was now not just a widow. She was a foreign widow, far from her homeland, surrounded by a grief so layered and so deep that it must have felt like the very ground beneath her feet had given way. She had left Bethlehem full. She was coming back empty, and she knew it. But then came news, quiet at first, like the first distant rumble of a storm that hasn't arrived yet, that the Lord had visited his people back in Bethlehem and given them food again. The famine was over. The fields were alive. God had remembered his people, and the house of bread was once again a house of bread. Naomi rose to return, and everything that came next would change her life, and Ruth's life, and the life of the entire world, in ways that no one standing in that dusty Moabite village could have possibly imagined. Naomi gathered what little she had and prepared for the long road back to Bethlehem. Orpah and Ruth rose with her, wrapping their cloaks around their shoulders in the cool, early morning air, ready to walk with their mother-in-law into whatever came next. The 3 of them set out together, their sandals finding the familiar stones of the road that led west, down toward the valley and the long journey home. But somewhere along that road, Naomi stopped. She turned and looked at the 2 young women walking beside her, and something in her heart broke open with a love that was bigger than her own grief. These were her daughters, not by blood, but by something deeper than blood. They had sat beside her in the dark hours after her sons died. They had held her hands and shared her silence. They had been faithful when faithfulness cost them something real. And now they were walking away from everything they had ever known, following an old woman into a foreign country with nothing waiting for them on the other side. Naomi could not let them do it. She stopped on that road, and she spoke to them with an honesty that only comes from a heart that has been completely broken and somehow survived it. She told them to go back. Go back to their mothers' houses, she said. Go back to your own people, to the land where you were born, to the gods you grew up with. You have been kind to me and to my sons, and may the Lord deal kindly with you in return. May he grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. You are young. You have your whole lives ahead of you. Go. She kissed them both, and all 3 of them wept. The sound of that weeping on a dusty road in the ancient Near East is one of the most human sounds in all of Scripture. These were not quiet, polite tears. This was the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep in the body, the kind that shakes your shoulders and blurs your vision and leaves you unable to speak for a long moment afterward. 3 women on a road, holding each other, none of them quite ready to let go. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and turned back. The Bible does not condemn her for this. It was the reasonable choice, the safe choice, the choice that any sensible person looking at the situation from the outside would have recommended. She was young, she was in her own country, and she had a chance at a future. She wept as she went, and Naomi watched her go with nothing but sorrow and love. But Ruth would not move. Naomi turned to her and urged her again. "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Go back after her." It was a practical argument. It was a loving argument. It was also, in its quiet way, one last door held open, one last chance for Ruth to choose the easier road. And Ruth looked at that open door, and she made her choice. What she said next has echoed across 3,000 years of human history. It has been spoken at weddings and funerals, carved into stone and stitched into fabric, whispered by missionaries in jungles, and sung by choirs in cathedrals. It is perhaps the most beautiful declaration of loyal love in the entire Bible, and it was spoken not by a prophet or a king or an angel, but by a young foreign widow standing on a dirt road with nothing in her hands and everything in her heart. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you," she said. "For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Read those words slowly and let them land. Ruth was not making a small promise. She was not saying, "I will walk with you as far as the border, and then we will see." She was surrendering her entire future, her homeland, her family, her culture, her gods, every familiar thing she had ever known, and binding herself to an old grieving woman with no land, no sons, no wealth, and no obvious reason to follow. She was choosing Naomi's God, the God of Israel, the living God who had made a covenant with his people, and she was doing it freely, completely, with both eyes open. Naomi heard those words, and she stopped urging her. There was nothing left to say. When someone chooses you with that kind of love, you do not argue with them. You simply receive it and walk forward together. And so they walked, the two of them, side by side, through the long, winding descent into the valley, and then the slow climb back up into the hill country of Judah. The landscape shifted around them as they traveled, the plateau grasses of Moab giving way to the rocky ravines of the Jordan Valley, and then the golden limestone hills of Judah rising up ahead of them, familiar to Naomi in the way that only the land of your childhood can ever be truly familiar. She had not seen these hills in 10 years. She had left them as a wife and a mother. She was returning as something she never expected to be. When they finally arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town stirred. The women of the town gathered around Naomi and said, "Is this Naomi? Is this really you?" And Naomi, standing in the town she had left full and returned to empty, gave them her answer with a rawness that would stop anyone in their tracks. "Do not call me Naomi," she told them. Naomi meant pleasant. "Call me Mara instead, a Hebrew word meaning bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" There is no false cheerfulness here, no tidy spiritual bow wrapped around her pain. Naomi was not pretending. She was a woman who had lost her husband and both her sons in a foreign land, and she was standing in her hometown telling the truth about what that felt like. And yet, even in that brutal honesty, she was still speaking the name of the Lord. She was still in relationship with him, still addressing him directly, still wrestling with him the way that people only wrestle with someone they have not given up on entirely. It was the beginning of the barley harvest when they arrived. The fields around Bethlehem were alive with gold and movement and the sound of workers cutting grain under the open sky. And walking beside the bitter, broken, returning Naomi was a young Moabite woman named Ruth, a foreigner, an outsider, a woman with no inheritance and no status and no guarantee of anything, who had chosen all of this with her whole heart. The harvest was just beginning, and so was everything else. Ruth did not wait for someone to come and rescue her. That is one of the first things you notice about her. She was not a woman who sat down and waited for life to happen. The morning after they arrived in Bethlehem, while Naomi was still gathering herself, still finding her footing in a town that remembered her from another life, Ruth rose early and asked a simple, practical question. "Let me go to the fields," she said, "and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." That word, glean, needs a moment of explanation, because it unlocks everything that follows. In ancient Israel, when farmers harvested their fields, they were commanded by God's own law not to strip the land completely bare. They were to leave the edges of the fields unharvested, and they were to leave behind whatever stalks the reapers accidentally dropped. This leftover grain was meant specifically for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner, the most vulnerable people in society. It was not charity in the modern sense of someone handing you something out of pity. It was hard, physical, exhausting work. The gleaner had to walk behind the harvesters all day in the heat, bending down again and again to pick up single stalks of grain from the stubbled ground. But it was dignified work, lawful work, work that the God of Israel had built into the very structure of his law, so that no one who was willing to labor would be left to starve. Ruth was willing to labor. She asked Naomi's permission and went out at dawn. Now here is where the story shifts in that quiet, unmistakable way that only divine providence can produce. The kind of shift that looks like coincidence on the surface, but carries the fingerprints of God all over it. Ruth walked out into the fields of Bethlehem, a young foreign woman in an unfamiliar town, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to a man named Boaz. She did not know whose field it was. She simply went where her feet took her. But the man who owned that field was not just any man in Bethlehem. Boaz was a man of standing, wealthy, respected, influential in his community. And more than that, he was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. In the intricate web of Israelite family law, this detail was not a footnote. It was a thread that, once pulled, would unravel and then reweave an entire future. Boaz came out to his field that morning from Bethlehem, the way a man does who takes his work seriously and likes to see things with his own eyes. He greeted his workers with a warmth that tells you something about his character. "The Lord be with you," he said to them, and they answered back, "The Lord bless you." This was not empty politeness. This was the language of people who actually believed that God was present in the ordinary moments of a harvest morning, in the sweat of honest work, in the smell of cut grain and warm earth. Then Boaz noticed her. He asked his servant who she was, and the servant told him, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She asked to glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers, and she has been on her feet since morning, without resting even for a moment." Boaz walked toward her, and what he said to this young foreign woman, a widow, an outsider, a person with no claim on his generosity whatsoever, reveals the kind of man he was down to the bone. He told her not to go to glean in another field. "Stay here," he said, close to my young women. Watch where they reap and follow after them. I have charged the young men not to touch you. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Ruth fell to the ground and bowed her face low, and she asked the question that any honest person in her position would have asked. "Why have you noticed me, a foreigner? What have I done to deserve your kindness?" And Boaz answered her with words that show he already knew her story. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me," he said. "How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That image of a small, vulnerable creature sheltering under the vast, warm, protecting wings of something infinitely greater is one of the most tender pictures of God in all of Scripture. Ruth had left everything she knew and thrown herself on the mercy of a God she was still learning to trust. And now, a wealthy Israelite farmer, a man she had never met before this morning, was standing in a field telling her that God had seen every step she had taken and that none of it had gone unnoticed. Ruth's response was quiet and full of grace. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said, "for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz called her over and told her to come and eat bread and dip her piece in the wine. She sat beside the reapers, and he passed roasted grain to her, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Then he gave quiet instructions to his young men that went far beyond what the law required. "Let some handfuls fall on purpose for her," he told them. "Leave them for her to pick up, and do not rebuke her." This was a man who understood that the law of God was not a ceiling to reach up to, but a floor to build upon. He did not just technically comply with the gleaning laws and leave Ruth to scrape by. He actively, quietly, deliberately made the path easier for her, without embarrassing her or making her feel like a charity case. He gave her dignity along with the grain. Ruth worked in the field until evening. When she beat out what she had gleaned, it was about an ephah of barley, a measure that scholars and biblical historians generally estimate at somewhere between 29 and 50 pounds of grain, which was an extraordinary amount for a single day of gleaning. Far more than chance, far more than a lucky morning. This was the quiet, unmistakable abundance of a God who notices the faithful and provides for them in ways that exceed every reasonable expectation. She carried it back to town. Naomi saw the grain, and her eyes went wide. "Where did you glean today?" she asked. "Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth told her, "The man's name is Boaz." And Naomi's breath must have caught in her throat, because she knew that name. "May he be blessed by the Lord," she said, "whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. That man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." That last word, redeemer, was about to become the most important word in the story. In ancient Israel, a redeemer was a close male relative who had both the right and the responsibility to step in and restore what a family had lost. He could buy back land that had been sold. He could marry the widow of a deceased relative to carry on the family name. He was the living embodiment of the principle that family does not abandon family, that the community does not leave its most vulnerable members to sink alone. Naomi had a redeemer. Ruth had found his field on her very first morning in Bethlehem, and neither of them, standing in that small room in the fading evening light, with a pile of barley between them, could yet see the full shape of what God was building. But something was moving. Something quiet and deliberate and unstoppable was already in motion, the way a river is already moving, long before you can see where it is going. Ruth continued to glean in the fields of Boaz through the entire barley harvest, and then through the wheat harvest that followed. Weeks of early mornings and long days under the open Judean sky. Weeks of bending and rising and carrying. Weeks of quiet, faithful labor that built something in her character that no amount of easy living could ever have produced. She stayed close to the young women of Boaz's household, just as he had told her, and she came home each evening to Naomi with grain and with the small, accumulating details of a life slowly finding its footing in a new land. And Naomi watched all of this. She watched with the eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of God's hand moving through ordinary circumstances, even when that hand was still only half visible. She had called herself Mara, bitter, on the day she arrived back in Bethlehem. But bitterness and faith are not always opposites. Sometimes the most faithful thing a person can do is hold both of them at the same time. Keep showing up, keep watching, and wait to see what God does next. What Naomi saw in Boaz was not just a generous employer. She saw a redeemer. She saw a man with both the legal standing and the evident character to change everything. And she also understood something that Ruth, still young and still learning the intricate customs of Israelite life, might not have fully grasped yet. That in this culture, at this moment in history, a woman did not simply wait to be noticed. There were ancient customs, carefully observed rituals of approach, ways of signaling intention that a man of honor would understand and respect. Naomi knew those customs, and she loved Ruth too much to stay silent. One evening, when the barley harvest had been threshed and the winnowing was done, and Boaz was preparing to spend the night at the threshing floor to guard his grain, a common practice in those days, when a man slept near his harvest to protect it from theft, Naomi called Ruth to her side and spoke with the quiet urgency of a woman who has thought this through very carefully. "Wash yourself," she told her. "Anoint yourself with oil. Put on your cloak. Go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." This passage has caused readers across the centuries to pause and ask questions, and those questions deserve an honest answer. What Naomi was describing was not a romantic encounter in the modern sense. It was a culturally specific act of legal petition, a way of formally appealing to a kinsman redeemer and asking him to fulfill his family obligation. Uncovering the feet of a man and lying at them was a recognized posture of humble appeal in the ancient Near East, a gesture that said, "I am placing myself under your protection and asking you to act on my behalf." It was understood by both parties for exactly what it was. Ruth was not sneaking into a man's bedroom. She was approaching a relative with a formal, honorable request wrapped in the language of her adopted culture. Ruth listened to everything Naomi said, and then she gave the answer that by now we recognize as the sound of her character. "All that you say, I will do," she told her. No hesitation, no long negotiation, no catalogue of fears, just complete, clear, trusting obedience to her mother-in-law, and through her mother-in-law, to the God she had chosen on that road out of Moab. She went down to the threshing floor in the night. The air would have been cool, carrying the dry, sweet smell of threshed grain and the faint earthiness of the hillside. The workers had eaten and drunk, and Boaz had gone to lie down at the far end of the heap of grain, satisfied and at peace. Ruth came quietly in the darkness, her footsteps careful and soft on the packed earth floor. She found where he lay. She uncovered his feet, and she lay down. At midnight, something startled Boaz. He woke and turned, and in the darkness he found a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who was surprised but not afraid. And Ruth answered him with words that carried both humility and extraordinary courage. "I am Ruth, your servant," she said. "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Spread your wings over me." She was using the very same image that Boaz himself had used when he blessed her in the field. The image of God spreading his protecting wings over those who take refuge in him. Now she was asking Boaz to be, in the most tangible and practical sense, the human embodiment of that same sheltering love. She was not just asking for grain, she was asking for a future. She was asking for restoration. She was asking him to see her, a Moabite widow with nothing to offer but her faithfulness, and choose her anyway. The silence that followed those words must have lasted only a moment, but it was the kind of moment that contains a whole world inside it. Then Boaz spoke, and every word he said was like a stone being set carefully into place in the foundation of something that would last. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter," he told her. "You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of excellence." A woman of excellence. In the Hebrew, the word used here is the same word used in Proverbs 31 to describe the ideal woman of noble character. A word that carries the weight of strength, virtue, valor, and worth all at once. Boaz was not flattering her. He was bearing witness to what the entire town already knew. Ruth's reputation had arrived before her petition. Her faithfulness had spoken louder than any argument she could have made on her own behalf. But then Boaz told her something she did not yet know. "There is a Redeemer nearer than I," he said. "There is another man, a closer relative, who has the first legal right to act as kinsman redeemer. In the morning, if he is willing to redeem you, let him do it. But if he is not willing, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning." She lay at his feet until the morning, but rose before it was light enough for anyone to be recognized. Because Boaz was careful with her reputation, careful with her honor, careful in the way that a man who genuinely respects a woman is always careful. Before she left, he measured out 6 measures of barley, poured them into her cloak, and sent her back to the city. She was not returning empty-handed. She was not returning with uncertainty alone. She was returning with the weight of a promise in her arms, even if that promise still had one more obstacle to clear. When she came back to Naomi and laid out everything that had happened, every word, every gesture, every measure of grain, Naomi listened with the focused attention of someone reading a map. And then she said the words that revealed just how well she knew the man she had sent Ruth to find. "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Naomi knew. She knew Boaz. She knew his character. She knew that when a man like that made a commitment in the darkness of a threshing floor in the middle of the night, he was not the kind of man who woke up in the morning and quietly hoped the situation would resolve itself without him. He was already moving. He was already at the city gate before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. And at the city gate, everything was about to come to a head. The city gate of Bethlehem was not simply an entrance to a town. In the ancient world, the gate was the place where life's most serious business was conducted, where disputes were settled, where contracts were made, where the elders of the community gathered to witness and to judge. It was the courthouse and the town square and the public forum all in one. When Boaz went to the gate that morning, he was not going for a casual conversation. He was going to settle something, and he was going to do it properly, in front of witnesses, in the way that his culture demanded and his character required. He sat down and waited. And in what can only be described as the kind of timing that makes you stop and look up at the sky and wonder, the very man he was waiting for, the closer relative, the man with the first legal right of redemption, came walking by at that exact moment. Boaz called out to him and asked him to sit down. Then he gathered 10 of the elders of the city and asked them to sit as well. 10 witnesses. Everything above board, everything in the open, everything done with full transparency in front of the community. The Bible does not tell us the name of this nearer Redeemer. It refers to him simply as friend, or in some translations, by a term that essentially means a certain someone, a deliberately unnamed placeholder. Some biblical scholars suggest that this anonymity was intentional, that the author chose not to preserve his name because he chose not to fulfill his responsibility. In a culture where a man's name was his legacy, his inheritance, his continuity into the future, the absence of a name was itself a kind of judgment. He would not be remembered because he chose not to act. Boaz laid out the situation clearly and carefully. Naomi, he explained, had come back from Moab and was selling the parcel of land that had belonged to their relative Elimelech. As the nearest kinsman redeemer, this man had the first right to buy it back, to keep it within the family, to restore what had been lost. Boaz made the offer formally, publicly, with all 10 elders watching. "If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, so I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The man said he would redeem it. Of course he would. Land was wealth. Land was security. Land was the foundation of everything in that world. A piece of land in Bethlehem, bought at a widow's price, was a straightforward financial gain, and the man was ready to take it. Then Boaz added the rest of the picture. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi," he said, "you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And just like that, the calculation changed. Taking Ruth as a wife meant that any son born to them would legally carry the name and the inheritance of Mahlon, Ruth's dead husband. It meant that the land this man was about to acquire would not ultimately belong to his own family name. It would pass to Ruth's son. It meant he would be spending his own resources to build up someone else's legacy. And beyond the legal complexity, there was Ruth herself, a Moabite woman, a foreigner, a widow with no social capital and no connections in Bethlehem. For a man already calculating profit and loss, this was simply too much. "I cannot redeem it for myself," he said, "lest I impair my own inheritance. You take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." There it was. The door swung open. The man who had every legal right to be Ruth's redeemer looked at the full cost of what redemption actually required, the inconvenience, the sacrifice, the willingness to pour yourself out for someone else's future. And he stepped back. He handed Boaz his sandal, as the custom of the time required, to formalize the transfer of a legal right. And he walked away unnamed into the rest of his ordinary life. And Boaz turned to the elders and to all the people gathered there, and he spoke with the clear, unhesitating voice of a man who had already made his decision long before this morning, and was simply now making it official. "You are witnesses this day," he said, "that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." The elders answered him with a blessing that rang out across that ancient city gate like a proclamation. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." These were not empty words. Rachel and Leah were the great mothers of the nation of Israel, the women through whom the 12 tribes were born. To invoke their names over Ruth was to place her in that same lineage, to declare that this Moabite woman, this foreigner, this widow, this woman who had arrived in Bethlehem with nothing but her faithfulness and her love for an old grieving woman, was now being woven into the very fabric of Israel's story. The elders of Bethlehem were, without fully understanding what they were saying, welcoming Ruth into a story far larger than any of them could see. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And the Lord, who had been present in every step of this journey, in the famine and the exile and the grief and the gleaning and the threshing floor and the city gate, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. When the child was born, the women of the neighborhood gathered around Naomi and said words that must have landed on her like rain after a long drought. "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer." And they gave the child his name, Obed. Naomi took the child and held him to her chest, and the women around her said something extraordinary. A son has been born to Naomi, not to Ruth, not to Boaz, to Naomi. Because in the intricate, beautiful logic of redemption, this child was the restoration of everything she had lost. He was the answer to 10 years of grief and emptiness and the long, bitter road back from Moab. He was the living proof that the God who had allowed her to go out full and return empty had not abandoned her, that he had been working quietly and purposefully through every single moment of the loss. And then the book of Ruth does something that no one reading the story for the first time ever fully expects. After 4 chapters of intimate, human, ground-level storytelling, after all the tears and the gleaning and the threshing floor and the city gate, the text suddenly pulls back to the widest possible view and reveals what has been hidden in plain sight the entire time. Obed, it says, was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king, the man after God's own heart, the ancestor of the one whom all of Israel had been waiting for since the very beginning. Ruth the Moabite, the outsider, the widow, the woman who chose faithfulness when she could have chosen safety, was the great-grandmother of King David. And through David's royal line, she was an ancestor of Jesus Christ himself. The story that began with a famine in Bethlehem and a family's desperate journey into foreign territory had been, from the very first page, a thread in the longest and most beautiful story ever told. And neither Ruth nor Naomi nor Boaz, standing in that small town under the Judean sun, could have possibly known the full weight of what their faithfulness was carrying. But God knew. God had always known. And He was not finished yet. There is a moment near the end of the book of Ruth that is easy to read past if you are moving too quickly. It is the moment when Naomi holds the newborn Obed in her arms, and the women of Bethlehem gather around her and speak his name over her like a blessing. It is a quiet moment. There is no thunder, no parting sea, no pillar of fire. Just an old woman and a baby, and a circle of neighbors in a small town that most of the ancient world had never heard of. And yet, inside that quiet moment is the heartbeat of the entire Bible. Think about where Naomi had been. She had left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 sons, full of life and hope and the ordinary expectations of a woman who believed the future held good things. She had watched her husband die in a foreign land. She had watched both her sons follow him into the ground. She had stood on a road in Moab and told 2 young women to leave her because she had nothing left to give and no reason left to hope. She had walked back into her hometown and told the women who recognized her not to call her pleasant anymore. "Call me bitter," she said, "because God Himself has emptied me out." And now she was holding a baby, and his name meant servant, and he would grow up to be the grandfather of the greatest king Israel ever knew. And that king's line would carry forward, generation after generation, until one night in this very town of Bethlehem, this small, overlooked, improbable house of bread, a young woman named Mary would wrap her newborn son in cloth and lay him in a manger, and the angels would fill the sky with light, and nothing in the world would ever be the same again. Naomi could not see any of that from where she was standing, but God could. God had been able to see it from the very beginning, from the moment the famine drove a frightened family east into Moab, from the moment a Moabite girl named Ruth stood on a dusty road and chose a God she barely knew over every comfortable and familiar thing she had ever loved. Every step of the story, every loss, every grief, every seemingly random turn, had been held in the hands of a God who wastes nothing and abandons no one. This is the God of the book of Ruth, not a distant God who watches human suffering with cold detachment, not a God who only shows up when the circumstances are dramatic enough to merit His attention, but a God who is present in the ordinary, in the fields and the harvests and the city gates and the threshing floors and the small, faithful decisions that no one else notices. A God who works through the loyalty of a foreign woman and the generosity of a landowner, and the stubborn love of a grieving mother-in-law to accomplish something so vast and so beautiful that it would take another 1,000 years to fully reveal itself. Ruth was not an Israelite. She was not born into the covenant. She had no natural claim on the God of Abraham or the promises he had made to his people. She came from Moab, a nation that was considered outside the boundaries of God's chosen people, a place where different gods were worshipped and different customs were kept. And yet, God did not see her as an outsider. He saw a woman who had heard something true about him, perhaps in the life of Naomi, perhaps in the stories Mahlon had told her, perhaps in some quiet moment of her own heart, and who had decided that this God was worth everything. She walked away from her homeland and her family and her gods, and she said, "Your God will be my God," and she meant it with her whole life. And God received her completely, unreservedly, with abundance that went far beyond anything she could have asked for or imagined. This is the gospel hiding in the oldest pages of the Old Testament. The gospel, that word simply means good news, the best news ever spoken, is the announcement that God has made a way for every person on earth, regardless of where they were born, or what they have done, or how far they feel from anything sacred, to be received into His family, to be redeemed, to be restored, to be given a future and a hope. Ruth the Moabite is living proof that God's love has never been limited by nationality or ethnicity or religious background or personal history. It has always been available to anyone willing to come under His wings and take refuge there. Boaz, in all his quiet generosity and unhesitating faithfulness, points forward to someone greater than himself. He is what theologians call a type, a living picture, an early sketch of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus is the ultimate Redeemer. He is the one who saw humanity in its most desperate condition, empty, exiled, separated from God by the weight of everything we have done and everything we have failed to do. And instead of calculating the cost and stepping back the way the unnamed man at the gate did, He stepped forward. He paid the full price. He spread His wings over us when we had no right to ask Him to. He chose us, not because we had earned it, or deserved it, or could offer Him anything in return, but because that is who He is, and that is what love does when it is deep enough and real enough and strong enough to go all the way to the end. The book of Ruth begins with emptiness and ends with fullness. It begins with famine and ends with harvest. It begins with 3 widows weeping on a road, and ends with a child being held in the arms of a grandmother who thought she had nothing left. And woven through every single page of it, invisible to the characters, but unmistakable to anyone reading with open eyes, is the hand of a God who never stopped working, never stopped providing, never stopped moving toward the restoration of everything that had been lost. If you are reading this today and you feel like Naomi, like you went out full and came back empty, like the losses have stacked up so high you can no longer see over them, like God has been silent for so long that you have started to wonder if He is even there, then the book of Ruth was written for you. Because the same God who turned Naomi's bitterness into abundance, who gave Ruth a future she could not have imagined on that road out of Moab, who moved through 10 years of grief and a harvest field and a threshing floor and a city gate, to bring a child into the world whose bloodline would eventually carry the Son of God himself. That God is still working. He is working right now, in the ordinary details of your life, in the things that look like coincidence and feel like nothing, and carry the fingerprints of heaven all over them if you know how to look. Ruth's story did not end in Moab. It did not end on the road. It did not end in the fields or at the threshing floor, or even at the city gate. It ended with a name whispered over a baby, with a grandmother's arms full after years of emptiness, with a lineage that reached all the way forward through the centuries to a stable in Bethlehem, and a cross on a hill outside Jerusalem, and an empty tomb on the third morning that changed everything forever. Jesus Christ is the final Redeemer. He is the one to whom the whole story was always pointing. He is the kinsman who had every right to step back and let us bear the consequences of our own choices, and who instead stepped forward and said, "I will redeem them. I will pay the price. I will spread my wings over them and bring them home." That offer is open to you today. Not because you have earned it, not because your story is clean or your record is clear or your faith is strong enough, but because the Redeemer is willing, because He has already done the work, because the same love that drove Boaz to the city gate before the sun had fully risen is the love that drove Jesus to the cross before the world had any right to ask Him to go there. If this story moved something in your heart today, if you felt something stir when Ruth said, "Where you go, I will go," if you felt something shift when Boaz said, "Spread your wings over me," and he answered without hesitation, then do not let that feeling pass without following it somewhere. Open the book of Ruth and read it for yourself. It is only 4 chapters long, and it will take you less than 20 minutes, and it will give you more than most books 10 times its length. Let it lead you to the God who is behind it. Let it lead you to Jesus, who is the point of all of it. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Not because we are asking you to click a button, but because there is someone in your life right now who feels like Naomi on the road, empty, bitter, convinced that the best chapters are behind them, and they need to know that the God of Ruth is still writing stories, and He has not run out of harvests yet. Like this video if it blessed you, leave a comment telling us what moved you most, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the greatest book ever written. Because the house of bread is open, the harvest is ready, and the Redeemer is willing.